Yeah, I'll react to that. Sure. All right. We're going right at next in that blah blah words. We're going right into it. I just finished the previous one, 1814 to 1846. Oh, I didn't like it. I did like it. I just did. And so now we are doing the next part.
Despite the settling of the Oregon dispute in 1848, Polk continued to re-energize the Monroe Doctrine into one of action. The subsequent continued American expansion strained relations in the 1840s, and with threats of annexing Hawaii, politicians like Aberdeen began to wonder if the United States' territorial appetite would ever abate. Central America was the next area of conflict, as both nations sought to extract favourable economic concessions. The Clayton-Bulwer Treaty was, after much wrangling, concluded between Britain and the US, which stipulated neither will exercise any dominion over any part of Central America. But as so many times before, it meant little in an atmosphere poisoned by suspicion. The tensions continued. In 1852, Spain tried to persuade France, the United States and Britain to join a self-denying ordinance with respect to Cuba. Only the United States refused, and the Secretary of State, Everett, boldly asserted that the manifest destiny of his to join a self-denying ordinance with respect to Cuba. Only the United States refused.
Okay, so Spain. Okay. All right.
And the Secretary of State, Everett, boldly asserted that the manifest destiny of his country would involve the acquisition of all European territories in the Americas. In 1852, Pierce, an expansionist, was elected president. It was obvious the struggle in Central America was far from over. In February 1853, Russell brusquely rejected Everett's thesis, and in the following year, Clarendon assailed the Monroe Doctrine itself. Her Majesty's government cannot admit that doctrine as an international axiom which ought to regulate the conduct of European states. Gradually, the two powers drifted towards war once again. In 1856, an American adventurer, William Walker, seized Greytown on the Mosquito Coast. Palmerston pressed for the fleet to be sent and for the chastisement of Mosquito. In 1856, an American adventurer, William Walker, seized Greytown on the Mosquito Coast. Palmerston pressed for the fleet to be sent and for the chastisement of Nicaragua, which was supporting Walker. Calmer voices prevailed in cabinet, supported by Disraeli in the Commons. For the first time since Canning, there was a genuine attempt to review the basis of British policy towards the United States. As Disraeli observed, if England is to regard every expansion of the United States as an act detrimental to her interests and hostile to her power, we shall be pursuing a course which will involve this country in struggles that may prove of a disastrous character. Britain began recognising that in areas her interests were not significantly at stake, competing with the United States could only be to her detriment. Thus, between 1859 and 1860, a series of treaties were negotiated between Britain and the republics of Central America, surrendering many of the British claims and bringing to an end conflict in this era. Part of the reason for Britain's retreat in these areas was the changing economic relationship between the two. The United States had started the century dependent on imports from British industry. By the 1850s, this was clearly no longer the case, as the United States' own industrialization began in earnest. US industries were, by the end of the century, beginning to outpace their British counterparts. They were held
Guys, when did steel production start? Okay. So 1850s. Okay, so 1850s Bessemer process. Okay, so right around this time is when mass production of high quality steel started. Okay. Oh no, where is it? I gotta move this up so I don't forget. Okay. Fast forward if you want, guys. I'm just gonna read. Jeez. Oh, I mean, this is 1914. Okay. Oh, I wish you had earlier. 1880. Similar. And way up. Okay. All right. So clearly from 1880 to, okay.
Helped by Britain's dogmatic commitment to free trade, which allowed the dumping of American products in the imperial market. The United States, their British counterparts. They were helped by Britain's dogmatic commitment to free trade, which allowed the dumping of American products in the imperial market. The United States, by contrast, was highly protectionist, particularly after the 1857 tariff, created by James Buchanan, was replaced with the Morrill Tariff of 1861. This protected US industries from British competition, but was in reality far too high and helped give the country its infamous robber barons. Britain should have retaliated, especially once the immense agricultural potential of the United States was opened up in the 1870s that would go on to swamp Britain's domestic sector. But the dogma of free trade was too strong, and so the imperial market was increasingly encroached upon by the US. Nonetheless, by 1860, Anglo-American relations were then on a much better...
Did I just get this wrong? That the US's very dismissal view of free trade helped them out in overtaking Britain in a lot of sectors where Britain was much more, you know, staunch in their free trade. Did I...
better footing, but the establishment of Anglo-American relations were then on a much better footing, but the establishment of the Confederacy in 1861 would bring
Jesus.
the US. Not strong, and so the imperial market was increasingly encroached upon by the US. Nonetheless, by 1860, Anglo-American relations were then on a much better footing, but the establishment of the Confederacy in 1861 would bring a new period of difficulty. Palmerston could barely conceal his hope that the United States would disintegrate. On the whole, however, British opinion was divided over the Civil War. There was sympathy for the Confederacy among certain trading groups, the aristocracy, and those who disliked Yankee arrogance. Anti-slaving groups and radicals tended to prefer the Union. The American Civil War itself dealt a great deal of injury to British commerce, as the Union imposed a blockade upon Confederate ports, thus seriously damaging the important cotton trade with Britain. Union supporters in Britain were further undermined by the internal politics of the North, which initially restricted Lincoln from taking an unambiguous line on the issue of slavery, thus confusing many as to what the actual point of the war was. Palmerston, though a man who took extreme joy in making slavers' lives miserable, saw in the Civil War a chance to weaken the US. He was greatly assisted in this effort by Seward, the Secretary of State. His conduct in 1861 verged on the insane. In order to comply with international law, the European trading nations had to recognize the Confederacy as a belligerent power.
Guys, I was really confused over these next like 45 seconds, so I'm rewatching it.
By Seward, the Secretary of State.
Okay.
His conduct in 1861 verged on the insane. In order to comply with international law, the European trading nations had to recognize the Confederacy as a belligerent power. This did not mean a recognition of sovereignty. At a time when the US was poised on the brink of internal conflict, Seward proposed on the 1st of April 1861 that Spain, Britain, Russia and France be asked for precise explanations for their conduct.
But they recognize the Confederates as a belligerent power, so like the instigator, right? So why is the American, why is he mad? Is it because he didn't want, I mean, they were following international law. Is it because he didn't want them to recognize them as even having seceded, or?
Failing which, war was to be declared for precise explanations for their conduct. Failing which, war was to be declared. This was utter lunacy, and Lincoln unsurprisingly ignored the document, but Seward's hostile attitude to Britain in particular was well known. Britain received envoys from the Confederacy during the conflict, though no promise to recognise the state was ever given. Seward told Adams, the American ambassador to London, to threaten war if Britain had any communication with the so-called commissioners, the domestic enemies of the United States. Adams wisely disregarded this nonsense, but was unable to stop the threat becoming public knowledge.
Chill.
On the whole, most American policymakers were well aware of the dangers this type of recklessness could lead to, especially after troops were dispatched to Canada by Britain in June 1861.
Did they get rid of them?
And the British cabinet on the whole was committed to neutrality. In August 1861, it resolved not to recognise the Confederacy. There was some pressure for Britain to arrange a mediation with France, but it became increasingly apparent that any such intervention would be tantamount to supporting the Confederacy. The greatest threat to the policy of neutrality came from Union actions against British ships. In the past, there had been American support for the rights of neutrals and British claims for belligerents. During the Civil War, these roles were reversed. In November 1861, the Trent Affair erupted when a Union sloop stopped a British steamer and took off 2 Confederate diplomats bound for London. This was a serious error of judgment, for not only was the Confederate mission doomed to failure, this was the only conceivable issue that could bring Britain into the conflict. Palmerston issued a demand for the diplomats' return, which he believed would lead to war. But Seward, in a remarkable volte-face, convinced Lincoln's cabinet to give way. The Trent debacle was the most serious. The diplomats' return, which he believed would lead to war. But Seward, in a remarkable volte-face, convinced Lincoln's cabinet to give way. The Trent debacle was the most serious, though not the only, diplomatic breach between the two powers. Others included an argument over the Alabama, a privateer built in England that was widely known to be being constructed for the Confederacy. Russell failed to block the ship's departure, which Palmerston subsequently admitted was a mistake. With the war's end, the United States demanded compensation for the loss in shipping that had resulted from the Alabama's raiding. Claims such as this weren't settled until the Treaty of Washington in 1871, by which Britain agreed to pay $15.5 million in compensation, in return for about half of that from the United States to cover damage done to Canadian trade in
I'm assuming that's adjusted for inflation.
In return for about half of that from the United States to cover damage done to Canadian trade in the war. Overall, however, the threat of Britain ever intervening in the Civil War was always remote. There were nonetheless attempts to take advantage of America's inability to uphold Polk's aggressive version of the Monroe Doctrine. In May 1861, Spain reasserted control over Santo Domingo, though her authority collapsed within 4 years. A more serious threat to US interests occurred with a Franco-Spanish invasion of Mexico in 1862 over a moratorium on debt repayments. Palmerston originally had wanted to act in concert with these powers, but after a separate agreement with the Mexicans, decided he wanted no part in Napoleon III's plans for regime change. Britain subsequently pressured Spain to withdraw her contingent. France was not to be so easy. France was not to be so easily dissuaded, and it was not until the death of Maximilian of Austria in 1867 her involvement ceased. The Mexican affair strengthened Anglo-American relations as it confirmed the trend begun in Central America of Britain slowly detaching itself from the United States' sphere of influence. With the end of the Civil War in the Union's favour and the exponential economic growth that followed, it became increasingly apparent that Britain could not maintain its position as both a rival of the United States in the Americas and the European powers on the continent. Britain subsequently came to finally regard the US as a great power, and thus began altering her policy accordingly, avoiding clashes she may previously have taken up. But it was to be a long time until friendship became the basis of relations. Under Gladstone and Disraeli's ministries in the 1870s and 80s, the trend of recognising America as a great power continued. This did not, however, mean an end to disputes between the two. As the US grew in strength, it became more prepared to display it in the Americas. Britain tended to try and avoid friction on a case-by-case basis, without a significant reorientation in strategy. As usual, it fell to Salisbury to actually undertake a long overdue change in British policy. As a dyed-in-the-wool illiberal Tory, he had his class's instinctive fear of the United States. But he also understood that Britain could no longer put off the need to once and for all deal with the lasting areas of friction between the two countries. The spark for this change came in 1895 when the US Secretary of State, Olney, turned an old boundary dispute between Venezuela and British Guiana into a brash reassertion of the Monroe Doctrine. Salisbury originally tried to stall, presumably in the hope the Americans would get bored, but
Ted, I'm assuming that's during McKinley, and Teddy Roosevelt, I think, takes the presidency after McKinley, right? And so he's really known for, his big stick policy of, him and that, like, a famous American cartoon of him with the big stick and going around the Caribbean. So obviously they don't get bored of it. We don't get
Salisbury
bored
originally
of it.
tried to stall, presumably in the hope the Americans would get bored, but was overruled by the cabinet, which feared escalation at a time of heightened tensions with Europe. "We expect the French to hate us," Selborne declared, "but the Americans, no." Consequently, Britain agreed to US arbitration, a concession which Washington repaid with a settlement favourable to Britain in the dispute. London had, in effect, tacitly accepted the Monroe Doctrine meant American hegemony in the hemisphere. Salisbury and his successor at the Foreign Office, Lansdowne, then moved to eliminate all remaining sources of tension, relinquishing British claims to Panama, where the US intended to build a canal, on Alaska's boundary, where Canadian interests were sacrificed, and in the Spanish-American War of 1898.
Wait, what?
Canadian interests were sacrificed.
So
And in the Spanish-American, on Alaska's boundary, where Canadian...
So if we could see a little bit, I wish we could see a little bit further west. I always figured that the purchase from Russia of Alaska came with the borders that we have today, but because I believe I'm pretty sure we already bought it from Russia at this point, so it wasn't as big, and we actually gained this part of Alaska later.
Interests were sacrificed, and in the Spanish-American War of 1898, where Britain, as the only European power not openly hostile to the United States, wrecked German attempts to form an anti-American bloc, and subsequently supported US control of the Philippines over Germany's claim.
Together.
The Spanish-American War in many ways marked the penultimate evolution of the Anglo-American relationship. Almost overnight, the United States had carved out for itself a seat at the world table, and showed itself to be an imperial power, capable of projecting strength globally. It was, however, testament to how successful the change in
That probably sound bad. Imperialism, yes! Sorry.
Projecting strength globally. It was, however, testament to how successful the change in attitudes in both countries had been, that this newfound imperial status did not herald a new era of rivalry. On the contrary, in the opening decade of the 20th century, the presidency of Roosevelt showed it was now possible to combine the previously mutually exclusive beliefs of American expansionism and a somewhat pro-British stance. Roosevelt found a use for his country's rapidly growing economic strength in the creation of a large battle fleet. It was again a testament to the increasingly warm strength in the British stance. Roosevelt found a use for his country's rapidly growing economic strength in the creation of a large battle fleet. It was again a testament to the increasingly warm relations that, though Britain was nervous about the expansion, it provoked nothing like the reaction Germany's naval program did. In large part, this was because Roosevelt and Taft's expansionism was never truly embraced by the American public, and after 1908 their ambitions were reined in by a skeptical Congress. There was also the basic strategic fact that US sea power was hobbled by the need to defend two oceans, and if a war with the United States had become unpalatable to London, it was no more thinkable in Washington. British naval supremacy was, declared Roosevelt, the great guarantee for the peace of the world. For him, the purpose of the US Navy was not to compete with Britain, but to be a junior member of an informal two-power alliance that would secure Anglo-American interests. There was, of course, little wish for a formal alliance in
This is like a great happy ending. Well, it's only part 2, so.
Secure Anglo-American interests.
Love you guys.
There was, of course, little wish for a formal alliance in either of the two countries. Even so, by 1914, Anglo-American relations were better than in any period since the Revolution.
And what better time for that to be the case?
British Anglo-American relations were better than in any period since the Revolution. British possessions in the New World were secure, and capital from the City of London remained dominant in South America, but it was clear that in the Latin world and the Caribbean, the United States had become the hegemon. The contest over who would dominate the Americas was over. 1914 would bring about the start of a new competition for control of the world.
The end. And everyone lived happily ever after, and the whole next century, 1900 to 2000, will be filled with nothing but peace and prosperity. The end. Wrong. Really interesting, and I think masterstroke by Great Britain. I think that if tensions kept rising rather than, tensions kept rising rather than healthy relations rising, then the U.S. would probably look to conquer Canada, maybe. But yeah. Good. Great. I love these. Such a great channel. Old Britannia. Very well done. Yeah, I'm going to do part 3. Well, I'm going to put it in a separate video, but I'm going to do it right now. I also kind of want to watch that. By the way, guys, little tip. Tip time. You know, between the M and !/ key are 2 keys, the alligator keys, and you can go a little bit back and forward pixels. And also, if you hold down Control and click any video, it can open in the next tab. Just a little tip.
In 1856, the Crimean...
Thanks, guys, for watching. I hope you enjoyed that and learned something.
Upon the outbreak of...
Jeez. And yeah, I'll see you guys next time. Bye, guys. Join the Discord and hit subscribe, please. Do it for me. Bye, guys.